Well, hello and welcome. We're going to talk about Ketora et al. Chapter 10 today, addressing Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Let's get going. We've got 6 learning objectives to cover in this chapter: the reasons for economic union, patterns of international cooperation, the evolution of the European Union, and evolving patterns of trade as Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states embrace free market systems, strategic implications for marketing in these various regions, and the size and nature of marketing opportunities in the European, African, and Middle East regions. All right, so let's start with multinational market regions. So multinational market regions are a group of countries that seek mutual economic benefit and civility, associated peace. Multinational market regions are designed to reduce interregional trade and tariff barriers, and they're deliberately making agreements to cooperate economically. Free trade, of course, is the ultimate goal, and while some alliances are concerned about these free trade agreements, the fear of being excluded is actually greater. So the reason or justification for the existence of an economic union is about the favourable economic, political, cultural and geographic factors that can be a consequence. But of course, major flaws in one factor could destroy the union unless the other factors are strong enough to offset that weakness. And part of the issue with an economic union is that member nations within must actually give up part of their sovereignty. So this is why the advantages must be explicitly stated and they must be significant. In other words, the benefits have to outweigh the disadvantages involved. Many of the associations formed in Africa and Latin America, for example, have had little impact because the perceived benefits were not sufficient to offset the partial loss of sovereignty that they incurred. So within an economic union, there are various factors, including political and economic. So let's look at economic first. Every union shares development and enlargement of market opportunities as the basic orientation. So preferential tariff treatment for the member nations, common tariff barriers put against those that are outside of the union, and these unions stimulate internal economic development for all. Now, strong unions can actually settle economic disputes as well, but agreements and mechanisms must be in place for that to happen. And again, the benefits have to outweigh the costs for individual member nations. Moving from economic factors into discussing political factors, well, political factors are equally as important as economic factors, but economic factors are probably the basic catalyst for the formation of the union. Within the union, politically, participating countries must be generally compatible. Similar aspirations must be evident, and countries are not going to surrender part of their national sovereignty if that's not the case. So that compatibility criteria is very important. Now, unions typically may form in response to an external threat, and while communism or the threat of communism no longer exists, the importance of political unity to fully address all the benefits of economic integration is what has driven European countries to move towards the political union that is in place today. Now, from economic factors through political factors and moving on to geographic and temporal proximity factors. So what we're talking about here is that geography and time zones are not imperative, but they do facilitate functioning of the market. Transportation networks are more developed within and between countries that are in close proximity to each other. And distance across time zones is actually very important. We've recognised that trade tends to travel more easily in north-south directions than it has done historically. Issues of legal and illegal immigration are also important because it promotes economic integration amongst those countries that are in close proximity. Moving on to cultural factors. Now, cultural similarity eases the shock of economic cooperation activities. Member nations understand each other. They understand the people that they are doing business with when we have similar cultures involved. So agreements between countries with similar cultural orientations are those that are most likely to succeed. And agreements extend beyond cultural boundaries. We can see this with the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, previously known as NAFTA, and the DRCAFTA. The DRCAFTA is a free trade agreement that was passed in 2005 and includes US, Dominican Republic, and Central American countries. We're talking about a wide array of tariff reductions and aim to increase trade and employment amongst the signatory nations. So the DRCAFTA is a step toward the goal of free trade across all Americas. In terms of cultural diversity, we can look at the European Union to observe this. Language is actually not as much of a barrier as what is expected, but religion seems to be an issue. And although there is great cultural diversity in the European Union, key members share a long-established Christian heritage and are commonly aware of being European and what that means. However, this aspect of diversity may be unimportant as negotiations proceed with Turkey, for example, about EU membership. Language as part of the culture is recognised as not as much of a barrier as was expected, and so nearly every educated European can do business in at least 2 or 3 languages, and that linguistic diversity enabled trade to be facilitated. We have 5 patterns of multinational cooperation that Katora et al. Puts forward. We're talking about the least comprehensive, which is the regional cooperation groups moving forward or progressing towards a free trade agreement and onto a customs union, then a common market, and then a political union. So let's look at each of these in turn. So sorry, I missed a slide there. Here are the 5 patterns of multinational cooperation listed, and now we're going to look at each of these 5 in turn. So regional cooperation groups are also called regional cooperation for development, RCDs. This is the most basic economic integration and cooperation across multinations. Each country makes an advance commitment and they participate basically in financing a new joint venture. They purchase a specified share of the output of that joint venture. So it helps develop mutually beneficial industries. Then, progressing from a regional cooperation group to a free trade agreement. This is an agreement to reduce or eliminate customs duties and non-tariff barriers. Member nations maintain tariff schedules for external countries, and it provides members with a mass market without barriers to impede the flow of goods and services. So it requires cooperation and integration more so than the regional cooperation groups. Now, progression of multinational corporations moves from a free trade area agreement to a customs union. So, while a free trade area agreement is about reduced or eliminating internal tariffs, the customs union adds common external tariff on imports from outside of the union. Countries with customs unions include France, Monaco, Italy, and San Marino, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. The European Union was a customs union at one point. Okay, progression of multinational cooperation then moves to a common market. So the European Union evolved from the development of a common market, and that was the European Economic Community, the EEC. And what we're talking about with a common market is all internal tariffs and restrictions fully eliminated. We're talking about adopting a set of common external tariffs so that then we're facilitating the free flow of goods, services, including labour and capital. So the economy in a common market is unified, but each member nation maintains political sovereignty. Further progression of a multinational cooperation is a political union. The EU is a voluntary political union. So this is the most fully integrated form of regional cooperation. We're talking about complete economic and political integration. And it's either voluntary or it's enforced. As I mentioned, the EU is a voluntary political union. And given that's the case, the union is referred to as a Commonwealth. So two political unions came into existence in the 1990s. The Commonwealth of Independent States and the European Union, now threatened by the recent Brexit vote. So why are we looking at multination groups? Well, it's important to look at multinational groups given the global market that we currently operate within. There's a restructuring of Eastern European bloc into independent market-driven economies, the dissolution of the Soviet Union into independent states, worldwide trend towards economic cooperation, and enhanced global competition. These are reasons to view the market potential in a regional context. All right, so now let's look at the various geographies, starting with Europe. Okay, so every type of multinational market grouping exists in the European integration. No other group is more important than the European Union. And they've made progress towards complete economic and political union, where economic growth prevails even after the UK's exit. But there's a lot of diversity to overcome. We've already flagged language and cultural differences, individual, national and political differences are also part of the diversity challenge, and centuries-old restrictions that protect local national markets. So even though several member states have not fully implemented all the measures, they are making progress, and the proportion of directives not yet implemented in all 28 member states has actually fallen dramatically. So within the European Union, there are various institutions that facilitate this multi-nation union. We're talking about the European Commission, which initiates policy and supervises its observance by member states. Then there's the Council of Ministers, and this is a decision-making body that determines which proposals of the Single European Act to accept as binding to members. The Single European Act is an agreement ratified in 1987, and it was designed to remove all barriers to trade and to make the European community a single internal market. Now, another institution within the European Union is the European Parliament, which passes and amends legislation. And then there's the Court of Justice. This is the Supreme Court of the European Union. So the European Union actually uses three legal instruments. One, regulations binding the member states directly and having the same strength as national laws. Two, directives also binding the member states but allowing them to choose the means of execution. And three, decisions addressed to a government, an organisation or an individual binding the parties involved. Each month, the European Parliament meets for 3 weeks. Actually, in this building pictured in this graphic in Brussels, Belgium, and then for another week they moved to Strasbourg in France. That inconvenience of the 4th week was maybe a concession to French pride, or maybe we can write it off just to being better cheese and better wine in France. Okay, now let's talk about the European and Monetary Union. This is a provision of the Maastricht Treaty. It established creation and implementation of the euro, which is the common currency for all EU nation members. It established the central bank, helped fixed conversion rates, completed circulation of euro banknotes and coins, and led to 12 member states employing the euro starting in 2001. So the Greeks were actually quite resistant to adopting the euro, and they were very attached, and still are, to their 2,500-year-old drachma. And the truck in this graphic is in Athens Syntagma Square, and it's equipped with video projectors and euro information stands. And they took this truck to 40 Greek towns to inform the Greeks about the euro currency. And there continues to be much talk in Europe about returning to the drachma, but we'll see what happens. Watch this space. All right, what about expansion of the European Union? Expansion is actually a priority on the EU agenda. Many would agree that the EU has actually been quite successful. But there's four categories of long-term challenges facing the European Union. The effects of Brexit, of course, is that going to cause more disintegration? England wants out, Scotland wants to stay. There's other debates around other nation members. What about improving the union's economic performance and then deciding how to limit political aspects of the union and deciding about further expansion of the union? When we're talking about Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, we're talking about satellite nations of the former Soviet Union. These satellite nations are moving steadily toward post-communist market reforms, and so we see new business opportunities emerging. But within, we also see chaos and big risks, and it may well be exciting and much opportunity, but you have to go in with your eyes open. So the Eastern European and the Baltic states are continuing to try to adjust to these changes. And in terms of marketing, we need to look at, of course, political, social, and economic realities of the shift from a restricted social system to some version of the free market and capitalism. In Eastern Europe, it's dangerous to generalize because we have many distinct countries within. Most countries are privatizing state-owned enterprises, as is the global trend, and this is establishing free market pricing systems, relaxing import controls, and combating inflation to some extent. Now, in Eastern Europe, there's different levels of progress because some countries have taken different paths. While some are moving quickly towards free market benefits, there's been some transformation guided mainly by the spontaneity of innovative markets rather than government planners and technocrats. The point is, however, in Eastern Europe, most countries continue to make progress. Okay, marketing of tobacco may well be declining in developed countries, and this is leading to manufacturers directing more of their marketing efforts towards emerging economies. Philip Morris published a report recently estimating that the cost savings for the Czechoslovakian government was $1,227 every time a smoker dies. But obviously the company didn't think through the public relations implications of this grisly bit of research. Okay, what about the Baltic states specifically? They exemplify the difference in policy implementation, and we can see this in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All these three countries started out with roughly the same legacy, but inefficient industry and Soviet-style command economies has seen a variation across the three. Estonia, for example, acted quickly. They dropped the ruble, privatized companies and land, and let struggling banks fail. They adopted a free state trading regime, more so than Latvia and Lithuania. And this resulted in greater economic growth than other Baltic states. Now, formed after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, beginning in the late 80s and taking effect in 1991, we have the Commonwealth of Independent States. So the Baltic states were first to claim independence and separate, and the remaining 12 republics called themselves the newly independent states. This group of newly independent states regrouped to form the Commonwealth of Independent States. And this Commonwealth of Independent States is about a loose economic political alliance with open borders, but actually no central government. They have ties between the Slavic and the Central Asian republics, but that's somewhat tenuous. And despite the threats, many nations are actually economically successful. Okay, referring to the dissolution of the USSR, old symbolism of the USSR has been replaced by symbolism of free trade and free enterprise. And here in the main shopping district of St. Petersburg, we can see the Nike swoosh logo and the prominence of the red umbrellas of Coca-Cola. All right. Now moving from the USSR into Africa. In Africa, many countries are experiencing growth despite economic, political and environmental issues. In part, these issues are stimulated, in part, this growth is stimulated by increasing foreign direct investment, particularly from China for infrastructure projects. So the growth has actually been noted as quite remarkable in the sub-Saharan countries. African growth is expected to continue over the next 5 years. So Africa actually presents us with a bit of a paradox. We've got mostly a poor population, and yet it's a land with rich opportunities. And part of what we see going on is a strong entrepreneurial mindset. Cell phone service in Africa, for example, is widely available, even though we're talking about a country or countries with very low per capita income, actually amongst the lowest in the world. So what is the African Union? Well, it's comprised of all countries on the continent except for Morocco. It's a multinational market, but it's poorly integrated. And although many organisations are involved, it's actually quite hindered by political instability. We do have regional economic groups. We've got the Economic Community of Western African States, the Southern African Development Community, and the East African Community. So the Economic Community of Western African States is a 15-nation group, and this has an aggregate gross domestic product of more than 60 billion, and it's striving to achieve full economic integration. But the Southern African Development Community is actually the most advanced and viable of Africa's regional organisations. It has 15 member states and encompasses a landmass of 7 million square kilometres. So in that geography, we're talking about an abundance of natural resources and a population over 250 million. So South Africa is actually the region's dominant economy, and it has a GDP of over 200 billion, accounting for 76.8% of the Southern African Development Community market share. Moving from Africa to the Middle East and North Africa, we've got ongoing political turmoil accelerated in 2011 with the Arab Springs, and has resulted in economic disaster for several countries because it meant long-term consequences for international commerce, and much of that is still unknown. The hope is that democracy and freedom will increase economic opportunities, but the Arab Common Market set goals for free internal trade that are not yet successful due to disputes and differences that continue. Here we've got a graphic where the old meets the new in two big emerging markets. The Grand Bazaar in Istanbul is the oldest and largest covered marketplace in the world, dating back to the 15th century. But in modern Istanbul, the Grand Bazaar competes for customers with the ubiquitous McDonald's. You can see in this graphic, faint in the background is the Blue Mosque, which was built in 1616. And of course, the pyramids at Giza near Cairo are much older, but new construction methods and development are competing for the skyline there as well. Now, across Middle East and North Africa, we have various economic communities. We have the Greater Arab Free Trade Area. So here we're talking about the Persian Gulf, Egypt and Morocco. This is a 2005 agreement, but they're relatively still in the early stages of implementation. Then we've got the Economic Cooperation Organization, which is comprising of Iran, Pakistan and Turkey. Their goal is to develop infrastructure and reduce trade barriers. And then the Organization of the Islamic Conference. This is led by Iran and it's composed of Islamic countries. This is a strong common market, but of course it's hindered by conflict. All right, so what does all this mean for marketing? Well, multinational groups are a source of opportunities for organizations. And we're talking about production, finance, labor, and marketing decisions that are all affected by these market integrations. What we do know is that world competition will continue to intensify, and businesses are becoming stronger and, of course, gaining experience along the way. So regulation of business activities is strong in multinational regions. Strategically, consideration of these multinational regional agreements are important in terms of navigating the global market. We can recognize specific opportunities, however, and it's because economic integration actually creates mass markets. When we have multinations coming together, we have combinations of markets that have new dimensions and significance. And this is very important to businesses who are using mass marketing strategies such as mass production and mass distribution. Opportunities involve economies of scale, and marketing efficiencies can of course be achieved. The benefits derived may well be passed down to the consumer or the buyer, industrial buyers, as lower prices. And this leads to greater purchasing power. So most multinationals have programs to foster economic growth. Other implications of market integration include market barriers. These are deliberately created to protect businesses that operate within the multinational market's borders. Members of the multinational agreements or regions have the advantage, and companies willing to invest in production facilities in multinational markets may also benefit from these protectionist measures. But of course, it poses a challenge for exporters. All right. When we're considering market metrics, we use these metrics to determine size and character of the market. The three most disparate metrics across cultures are standards of living, infrastructures, and consumer purchasing. In the Americas, for example, this disparity seems to correlate with latitude. And what that means is that there's greater economic development the further you are away from the creator. Now, finishing up on marketing mix implications, organisations must adjust their strategies to reflect the anticipated market changes in the single European market. They need to look at price standardisation due to parallel importation. They need to look at fairer competition due to single currency of the EU. They also need to look at reduced number of brands due to standardisation and recognise the increased competition amongst retailers. International marketers should view multinational integration positively because it serves globalisation and harmonisation of world trade, and it leads to lower cost of business, more choice for consumers, and more opportunities for marketers. And there you go. That's the end of the chapter 10. And thank you for joining me. I'll see you soon for chapter 11.